Let's talk about biopsychology. It's the stuff inside of you that makes you do the stuff you do. So, to start, let's discuss the nervous system. Now, the nervous system is composed of a variety of nerves, as you might guess, and different divisions of the nervous system are responsible for different things. So, the first division is the difference between the central nervous system, which is composed of the brain and the spine, you know, right here, and the peripheral nervous system, which is basically everything else. It carries information from the body to the spine, to the brain, and then back from the brain to the spine to the rest of the body. We have our somatic nervous system, which is taking in a lot of the inputs that we get from our muscles and also sending information to them. And then we also have the autonomic nervous system, which is all the involuntary functions of your body. So if you're thinking about like hormonal regulation and your heartbeat, breathing, those automatic like breathing processes, like you were breathing probably before, and now you're thinking about breathing. So sometimes something that's autonomic can switch and be manually controlled. So when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, we want to understand the difference between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system, right here, is responsible for what is called the fight or flight response. So, if there were something loud and exciting, ooh, scary, right? Ooh, did I scare you? Sorry about that. That means that your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, is active. In a normal resting state, the parasympathetic nervous system, this guy over here, is active. That's sometimes called the rest and digest part of your body. So we have the fight or flight response, we have the rest and digest, right? These two are opposite processes which are responsible for controlling those automatic functions of our body. If we think that we're in danger, then the sympathetic nervous system is going to be active. People with anxiety are dealing with an overactive sympathetic nervous system, right? For example, if you have extreme social anxiety or social phobia, normal social situations invoke this fight or flight response where it actually feels like your life is in danger. So, a lot of dealing with like anxiety is trying to get people from a sympathetic nervous response to a parasympathetic nervous response. If you heard that, a cat just jumped into my laundry basket, knocking everything down. I can see his little heart beating. It's very adorable. It's very cute. And that's because he is having a sympathetic nervous response. It's a very basic response. He was relaxed and chill, but then something scary happened, and now he's prepared for danger. So I'm going to pause real quick and go fix the thing that he knocked over. Thank you, Kat. I hope you're happy with yourself. So next, let's talk about the neuron. The neuron is the basic cell in your brain and spine and the rest of your nervous system. When you're looking at the neuron, neurons connect to one another. So there are other neurons and they're sending signals down to even more neurons. These are my very well drawn neurons, and then they'll connect and they'll have, these signals, and they just keep on being sent down. Now, this signal that's being sent down is an electrical signal. So, a few things that we need to know. We have the cell body, also called the soma. If you see the term soma, it refers to the body. Then we also have dendrites. these are little branch-like structures that help connect neurons to other neurons. Then we have the axon. The axon is like a little wire that sends the signal down. And we have one other thing that I want you to pay attention to is the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is this insulating material around the axon. Now, you might notice that there are these areas that are not insulated. They're referred to as nodes of Ranvier. And the reason why these are important is because the signal doesn't just go straight down, it actually jumps from node to node. And this jumping actually makes sure that the signal, one, travels faster, but also keeps the intensity of the electrical signal. So our neurons are actually made to be very quick and efficient because when you're dealing with, the important things that our brains are doing, you don't want to have anything be slow. So that's the neuron. So again, we have the soma, the cell body, these branch-like structures, the dendrites. We travel down the axon, and we have these little bits of insulation referred to as the myelin sheath. So I lied a little bit about how the neuron works. Yes, we do have a signal that travels down the axon, but there's actually a little cleft between neurons. This is referred to as the synapse. So at the end of an axon, there's, you can see this is the end of an axon. We have these little uh, orbs of glory. They're called synaptic vesicles. I can remember what circles were called. I couldn't remember the term for circles. So these vesicles carry these little chemicals called neurotransmitters. Now, we'll talk about these more in just a second, but these neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, and the receiving neuron has these little receptor sites. And every receptor site responds to a different type of neurotransmitter, right? So once the right neurotransmitter gets to the right receptor site, the signal, that electrical signal, continues to go down the neuron. So we have an electrical signal and then a chemical signal, and our brain alternates between the two: electrical, chemical, electrical, chemical. So this chemical process is great for some reasons, but lots of things can go wrong. Now, when we're a thing that we're going to talk about in a second is how we can actually affect what's happening in the synapse. But we have the electrical signal that goes down. We have these vesicles filled with neurotransmitters that are released into the synapse. The neurotransmitters hit these little receptor sites on the receiving neuron, and then any neurotransmitters that haven't been used get sucked back in to the sending neuron in a process called reuptake. That reuptake process, remember it because it will be important in a second. Okay? So here are a few neurotransmitters that I want you to be aware of. So the just be aware of like some of the general things that they do. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are two very related neurotransmitters. Epinephrine is referred to as adrenaline sometimes, and norepinephrine is also referred to as noradrenaline. These two they hang out all the time. They're like best friends. They're almost never separated. And if you've ever had a friend with an allergy, they might carry an EpiPen with them. And that EpiPen, as you might know, is a shot of adrenaline, which technically means that it is a shot of epinephrine, EpiPen, right? So same chemical, just depending on where we're talking about it in the body, that's going to change what we call it. Now, so those are related to energy, arousal, alertness. When you have them in your brain, you feel good, right? In a sympathetic nervous response, you're going to get a lot of epinephrine, a lot of norepinephrine. Serotonin is related to our emotional states and our impulse control, as well as when we're dreaming, you'll get a lot of serotonin released uh, in certain drugs. So, for example, like LSD, those affect the serotonin that's being released in your body and allow you to have the wonderful experiences that one might have on those types of hallucinogenic drugs, right? Then we also have dopamine, which is great, responsible for the feelings of reward and motivation, responsible for voluntary motor control. So there are diseases where you have too much dopamine, and those are things like schizophrenia. You could also have diseases where you have too little dopamine, and those are diseases like Parkinson's. Fun fact, I'm not sure if this is a fun fact, but sometimes in treating schizophrenia, in order to treat it, you're lowering the amounts of dopamine that are actually in the brain. You're preventing them from getting to the receptor sites. So what ends up happening is a person might experience Parkinson's-like symptoms. It's referred to as tardive dyskinesia. So the this balance of dopamine in the body and in the brain specifically is very important. Too much, and you have psychosis. Too little, and you're having a very hard time coordinating your motor movements. GABA and glutamate are they're like opposites. They're always at war with each other. GABA is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter, and glutamate is a major excitatory neurotransmitter. So glutamate wakes you up. It enhances action potentials. Action potentials are the electrical signal that the little this is me trying to draw like a change in charge. If trust me, just it makes sense. So the that action potential is enhanced by the presence of glutamate. So it's making your neurons fire, right? It's also responsible for learning and memory because in order for us to learn and memorize things, we need to have active neurons. GABA is the opposite. It tells you to slow down. It's very helpful in reducing anxiety. It's also very helpful if you want to get drunk. If you did not know this, alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. Sorry. So it slows your brain down. So that inhibitory process is because of, that's a terrible arrow, forgive me, is because of the GABA that's being released by alcohol. So endorphins are related to pain reduction and reward. We feel good when endorphins are released into our brain. That's why opiates, heroin, morphine are so great because we don't feel bad and we feel real good, right? And if you've noticed that I didn't talk much about acetylcholine, yeah, motor control and attention and memory and learning and sleeping. You know, I don't feel like talking about it. Acetylcholine. Hey, Kat, how do you feel? Cisco, how do you feel about acetylcholine? Want? Do you think I should talk about it? Yeah, my cat hates acetylcholine, so I'm just not going to bring it up. So when we're dealing with neurotransmitters, we have what we have in the brain, but sometimes the brain doesn't do enough of what we want it to. So either when we're looking at like pharmacological interventions for mental illness, or maybe if you just want to have a little fun recreation time. There are a variety of things that a drug can do. We're just going to talk about a few of them. So let's say you didn't have enough of a specific thing. You could use an agonist. And what an agonist does is it goes into the receptor site. So maybe you have dopamine, right? It usually would go into this receptor site. But what if you had something that looked kind of like dopamine? It would still go into that receptor site and you would still get the same effect as dopamine, even though it wasn't the same chemical. So agonists mimic the effect of a neurotransmitter. If you might remember, we have the reuptake process, right? This thing where the neurotransmitters get sucked up. Sometimes you have a lot of neurotransmitters that are available, right? But they just don't have enough time to get to this receptor site. So by inhibiting that process, by slowing down that reuptake process, you give those neurotransmitters more time to get to the receptors. So sometimes you have too much of a neurotransmitter in the brain. So what you could do is use an antagonist. An antagonist blocks the receptor. So if you had too much dopamine, the dopamine tries to hit those receptor sites, but it can't. You could also use what's called a reverse agonist. A reverse agonist looks similar to the thing. So we have like a reverse agonist for dopamine, and it goes into the receptor site like that. Ignore this thing. It's going straight into the receptor site. Don't disappear yet. But it's actually evil. Oh, ha ha, ha ha, nah, right? So it makes the opposite of what dopamine normally would do happen. So not only does it block the receptor, but it causes the opposite effect of the normal neurotransmitter. Let's talk about some parts of the brain. Yeah, let's get crazy. So, just so you know, the brain evolved forward. So, what I mean by that is these back parts of the brain, the hindbrain, are the oldest parts of the brain. If you find a very simple organism, you'll see all these parts, but you won't see these developed cortices that we have. So the more advanced a brain is, the more you'll see these cortical structures right here. But this back part, the hindbrain, is responsible for those basic survival skills. So we have the cerebellum, and our cerebellum is responsible for our motor learning, our coordination, and balance. So if you were right now to try and stand on one foot, right, your ability to engage in that is based on your cerebellum. We also have the medulla, which is responsible for breathing, your heart rate, and other survival mechanisms. So any damage to the medulla and the brain stem would be pretty bad for you. So if somebody hit you like right here, right, you would probably end up in a coma. If somebody hit you right here, which is your occipital lobe, you would have what is called cortical blindness, where your eyes, hi, these are little eyeballs, your eyes would still work, right? The retina would receive light and the optical nerve would send it back to the occipital lobe, but your occipital lobe's ability to process information would be hindered. We also have the reticular formation right here, which is related to motor and cardiovascular control, so dealing with the heart, pain modulation, sleep, consciousness, and habituation. So how we adjust to the environment. Then we have the pons, which is more sleep and arousal. And what word is that? What happened to that word? Le fleke, le plefle, le flight, le fletite. Man, I'm gonna need a I'll need to look that one up. I'm not gonna do a second take of this one. I'm just gonna leave this mistake here because this is great. Le fletite, and also the coordination of our body. Left and right body movement coordination. Let me just scratch that out. Left, right. So the pons is a little bridge, and it helps. So you are getting information from the spine, and it routes everything to the proper hemispheres. So if you did not know this, you have a left and a right side of your brain, and they're responsible for different functions, right? They're highly specialized, and there's a little mound of flesh called the corpus callosum that helps both sides communicate with one another. But the pons is very useful for that coordination of information from the left and right side and the proper routing of information. And real quick, we have the midbrain right there. And then there's the substantia nigra. There's a lot of dopamine. That's one of the major dopamine areas of the brain. And that is responsible for the initiation of voluntary motor activity. So right now, I just knocked something off of my desk. Uh-oh. I go to reach it and reach it, and I go to reach out and grab it. That is the substantia nigra, which is helping me initiate that voluntary motor activity. Now we have some of the newer parts of the brain, still relatively to like, human existence, not not that new, but in the span of all development of life, newer. So we have the hippocampus, which is related to memory. Easy way to remember that is if you were on campus and you saw a hippo, that would probably be memorable. Then we have the thalamus, which is the sensory gateway. So almost all of our senses, except for smell, go through the thalamus and then are routed to other parts of the brain for further processing. Then we have the basal ganglia, which is responsible for motor planning, movement, and feelings of reward. So again, more dopamine there. Then we have the hypothalamus, which regulates our body functions like temperature and motivational things like hunger and thirst. And then we have the amygdala, which is responsible for emotions. So if you were feeling afraid, or if you are in love, or if you're afraid of love, that would be this little bean right here, like the little guy. Maybe we can give a little afro and like some glasses. Oh, look at him. He's fun. He's having fun. That's a cute little amygdala. So we just talked about what are called subcortical structures, which are in this area right here. And the reason why they're called subcortical, sub meaning below, or sometimes it means sandwich. Not sure if that's why they call them subs. But the subcortical structures are below the cortices. So we have the occipital lobe, I should say lobe, and that is in the back. So remember, I was talking about cortical blindness. That's if you experience damage to the occipital lobe. Then we have the temporal lobe over here, which is related to memory and understanding of language. This is the auditory processing area. Then we have the parietal lobe back here. So we have touch, spatial information, making sense of the world, arithmetic, spelling. Right in here, we have these two little cortices. We have the sensory cortex and the motor cortex. And then, almost most importantly, even though all of these are very important, we have this frontal lobe. And for us, as the humans that we are, this frontal lobe makes us who we are. The frontal lobe, especially this prefrontal cortex, is responsible for executive functions like thinking, planning, organizing. So your ability to go, okay, this lecture is super long. I'm going to watch 20 minutes of it now, another 20 minutes of it later tonight. Tomorrow, I'm going to watch another 20 minutes. I'm going to review stuff that I didn't understand. I'm going to start taking the quiz, and then I have notes so that I can refer to things while taking the quiz because the quiz is open note, right? The Because you have that frontal lobe, which allows you to plan, you can do those things. My cat cannot do that same amount of planning. I'm talking about you, Cisco. You're not good at planning. Get out of here. It also is responsible for our ability to control our impulses. Our frontal lobe actually doesn't develop fully until we are 25. So it is the last part of our brain to fully develop, which is why younger people tend to do more impulsive things, right? It's just because your brains don't develop until you're 25. So the if you remember, like if you think about who you were 7 years ago, and then you cringe a little bit, right? Like, oh man, I did so many dumb things. It's because of your frontal lobe. Everybody goes through it, right? It's the one thing that unites us all. We all had a very cringy childhood. So I mentioned this before. This is a brain. We have a little corpus callosum right here, which connects the two sides and allows them to communicate with one another. So your left eye might get information and it sends it to the right side of your brain. But in order to get the full understanding, both sides will communicate so that you can understand what is going on. So the corpus callosum is very important for both sides to communicate because both sides have things that they specialize in. Sometimes, in some cases, you might have to sever the corpus callosum. There are some types of seizures that can only be treated by severing the corpus callosum, and that results in what's called a split brain, where both sides, their main way of communicating is severed, which means that one side might not have the information that the other side has, so people who have a split brain have to compensate for that, right? So one thing that you might have heard is that some people are left-brained and some people are right-brained, but that's a misinterpretation of how the brain actually works. We're not just one or the other because our entire brain is based off of who we. It's a little fun brain. So, but our brain is based off who we are is based off of both sides of our brain working in tandem. So we're not one or the other. We are both. Another thing that people say is that like you only use 10% of your brain, but there's all this other stuff that we just like don't know what it does, right? Ooh, mysterious. That's not how that works. Now, all of your brain isn't always active at once because you don't need all your brain to be active at once. If more of your brain was active than it needed to be, then things would just be happening that don't need to be happening. For example, there's a part of your brain that's responsible for like remembering every embarrassing thing that you've ever done, right? You don't need that to be firing all the time. It fires enough. It could even take like a year off so you don't have to think every day about that one mistake that you made, right? Just me? Wow. Okay. Well, I feel alone. So there are different ways that we learn about the brain. We can, aside from just like cutting it open and just seeing like where things are, we can study different ways that the brain functions. So we can do what's called an fMRI, which allows us to look at how different parts of the brain function, or rather, which parts of the brain are active during different functions. So, if somebody's, feeling very sad, you might see one part of the brain light up, or if somebody's trying to like think of a specific how to solve a Rubik's cube, you might see another part of the brain light up. The EEG just amplifies the electrical waves so we can actually see what they look like and their activity. TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, uses very strong magnets to disrupt the brain's functions. Remember, it's an electrical signal for part of that signal. So a very strong magnet will disrupt that, and if you disrupt certain parts of the brain, you'll see that certain functions are affected. Then we have CAT scans, which just use cross sections of x rays to map different parts of the brain. And then we have PET scans, which basically you put a radioactive isotope in your bloodstream, and you can actually see where it goes based off of blood flow. So if certain parts of the brain are lighting up during a PET scan while you're doing a specific activity, you can see where the blood is flowing to. So this is an fMRI. As you can see, just a little bit, the person has a little thing that they're watching, and they have a little. It's basically like playing a video game inside this huge machine, which is monitoring what's actually happening in the brain, so you can see where specific things are happening. Right. So here's our temporal lobe over here. So maybe they're processing some auditory information. We have the frontal lobe, so maybe they're doing some planning, right? So depending on what things are happening, right, the more activity is going to create more heat, which you'll pick up in these little areas. And then the EEG, you can just see the brain activity now in a seizure, right? You're having a lot more activity than you actually want. And you can actually see, based off of this EEG reading, that the seizure is only happening on the left side of the brain. So you put these little electrodes on different parts of the skull, and they just respond to the very slight electrical signals that are being emitted. And then we have TMS, right? This thing right here creates a magnetic pulse on a specific part of the brain in order to see what happens. So you might want to stimulate something just to monitor how that part of the brain is working. And then we have the CT scan. The fun thing about the CT scan is you can get these really great 3D cross sections because the X-rays are coming at in three directions. So because you have all three planes represented, you can see very clearly what is happening structurally. And then we have PET scans. So you can see based off of the blood flow, right, what parts of the brain are more active than others because the radioactive isotope is going to those places. By the way, don't get a lot of PET scans because you're putting radiation in your body. So with all of these, like any medical intervention, you're making sure that the potential harm is outweighed by the good of seeing what's going on with the brain. Last part, we're going to talk about genes and evolution. Oh, yeah. So, if you do not remember Charles Darwin, he had this theory of evolution, which at this point is basically the law of evolution, which is the idea that over time, organisms adapt to their environments. Evolution can happen in very slight ways, and it can happen in very drastic ways. It just depends on what is happening. Now, uh, one part of that is natural selection. So different organisms might be better suited for their environment. Now, this idea of survival of the fittest is sometimes interpreted as survival of the strongest, which isn't necessarily true. It's whatever thing makes you most adapted to the environment. So here's a great example, right? We have a whole bunch of beetles. Some of them are green, some of them are orangish brownish. Now this crow, oh boy, this girl loves beetles. John, Paul, Ringo. I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that. You came to this class for education, not puns. But you're going to get puns. So the crow loves green beetles, right? He always goes and eats green beetles, but he doesn't eat the orange brown ones either because the crow just isn't interested in them or because the crow's having a hard time picking them out from the environment, right? So what happens over time is green beetles are going to have a much harder time uh, 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 reproducing. I was like, reciprocating? No, that's not the word. Reproducing, because they were dead. If you're dead, you don't do that very often. So uh, there are going to be less, or sorry, rather fewer green beetles introduced into the population of total beetles, and then eventually you have very few green beetles and a whole bunch of these orange and brown ones. So if we're looking at human evolution, right, we're not doing anything cool like sprouting wings, but over time we just start to adapt to our environment. There are things that would have killed us years ago that aren't a big deal now. For example, nearsightedness, right, or farsightedness, uh, because we can correct your vision with glasses or contact lenses or just lasers that we just shoot at your eyes, and everybody's just cool with that. Uh, there are things that would make us unadapted to the environment that aren't as big as an issue, or aren't as big an issue anymore. So evolution is interesting from a human perspective because in many ways, we don't really need to evolve that much because technology overcomes a lot of the biological issues that would cause that, 5, 10,000 years ago would have caused us a lot of trouble. Wow, we've had a lot of fun. We talked about brains and neurons and nervous systems. We almost talked about drugs a little bit. I said LSD. You can do the research. You'll figure it out. So we I don't know what I meant by that. I don't know what you're going to figure out that LSD is a drug. Now you know. So one big question is nature versus nurture. Are we more a product of our genes or our environment? It is a hotly debated topic, even to this day, and nobody knows if it's nature or nurture. Just kidding, we figured it out. It's both. Both things are related to your development. So, our genes have a very strong effect on who we are and who we become, but our environment does also make a difference. So, one thing to be aware of is what is called the diathesis stress model, which is the idea that if you hear hissing, they're cats fighting. It's just a like sometimes I try to like deal with them and I try to like put them in another room. But today I'm just going like, they're just going to be cats in this recording, and that's just a thing that we all have to deal with as a family. So so the diathesis stress model, you can tell how much I like re-recording things. I'm just like, yeah, cats are hissing. I dropped a pen. I definitely, choked on some water, but I think that take is good enough. Nature versus nurture, both. Diathesis stress model. Uh, our environment affects our genes. So let's say I have a predisposition for alcoholism, right? But I don't really have a very stressful life. So I never really need to learn how, I never turn to alcohol as a coping mechanism, or maybe I learn other coping mechanisms other than alcohol. So even though it's in my genes, it doesn't necessarily mean that I will develop alcoholism. That's the interaction between our genes and our environment. So the diathesis stress model looks at how our environment affects our genes. Now, it can also go the other way. There's what's called the reciprocal gene environment model, which is the idea that our genes help us pick our environment, and because we know that our environment affects our genes pick our environment, which then affect our genes. So let's say I'm an introvert, right? If I'm an introvert, I'm naturally going to avoid more social gatherings, which is going to reinforce the fact that I like staying at home. So my genes dictate my environment, which reinforce my genes. Or maybe I'm the type of person who's likely to develop a specific type of phobia, maybe a phobia related to injuries, right? But also, maybe I'm very impulsive. So I'm the type of person who's like, hey, want to see if I can jump off this thing, right? My impulsive genes dictate a situation in which I might injure myself, which then will trigger a different gene, which is responsible for my fear of injury. So, our not only are we a product of our genes and our environment, but our environment affects our genes, and our genes, in fact, affect our environment. One way that we understand this relationship between genes and environment is because sometimes people with the exact same genes are separated at birth, and we find this out once they're adults, and then we get to compare two people, twins, with the exact same genes who are raised in different environments. If nurture were everything about who we are, then we would see that these people are as different can be. But if our genes have an effect on who we are, then we would see that these people, despite being in different environments, are still very similar. And what we see is, despite these people being in very different environments, they end up in similar types of jobs. They end up marrying similar types of people. They end up having similar interests. So our genes do have a very significant effect on who we are. One little thing to point out, obviously twin studies work with identical twins, not as well with fraternal twins. So we refer to identical twins as monozygotic because when the sperm meets the egg and the cells start to multiply, these cells that multiply sometimes split into two bundles of cells that are multiplying, and these bundles of cells have the same genes. So they are monozygotic. They start with the same bundle of cells. Sometimes you have two eggs that both get fertilized with a sperm that both start multiplying. But the chances of these having the same genes is pretty low. So these are dizygotic, two zygotes. So when we're dealing with twin studies, we're dealing with monozygotic twins. Well, I think that's everything. Do you guys have any questions? Just kidding. It's the internet. You can't ask me a question right now. But toss me a comment or send an email. Yeah, that's I really should think of like a fun way to like end these things. I just kind of trail off awkwardly, and maybe I should have like a catchphrase like "See you later, Daddy-O." Jazz, jazz, baby.